great wisdom. They've been homeschooled by the Imam. And they went back to Africa, and they went back to India. And this is how Islam also spread. If you look at the spiritual elements within North Africa and India, the Imam alayhi salam, Imam al-Sajjad, is that source of the spirituality. So now turning back to this maid or the servant, she was pouring water as he was making his ablution, and she grew faint. And the jug of water slipped from her hands and hit the Imam pretty strongly. And then he looked up and she came to, and then quickly she had the sense of mind to say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Quran says, and she's by the way quoting the verse that Brother Mubarak had opened with, which is Surah Ali Imran verse 134. She begins Al-Kadhimin al-Ghayth quickly. She got maybe a little bit scared, or I don't know, which translates to those who restrain their anger. And the Imam alayhi salam says, I've restrained my anger. And then she continues with the verse. She thought maybe I can get a little bit more out of this. And she continues with the verse, وَالْعَافِينَ عَنِ النَّاسِ, and those who forgive the people. And the Imam alayhi salam says, you are forgiven. And then, again, this is how genius she was. This is a maid. But let's remember, this is the maid who was educated by none other than her master, Imam al-Sajjad. So she ends with the final portion of that verse, وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, and Allah loves those who do good. And the Imam says, you are free. So here's his clemency, his sense of forgiveness. But also, when you read in between the lines, you can see how the Imam alayhi salam had this program of education. Now, there's in this respect as well, in terms of his clemency, there was a person who had slandered him, and he would say, he would curse the Imam, he would abuse him, he would slander him, he would speak ill before him. So the Imam alayhi salam approached him and he says, how would you approach someone who would slander you? You'd come, with a degree of anger, wouldn't you? And he comes and he says to him, with all gentleness, if I have what you say, I'll ask Allah to forgive me. And if I do not have what you say, then I ask Allah to forgive you. And this person was astounded. You don't anticipate that as the reaction of the person who you've been speaking ill. And he realized, I guess there was a change of heart, and he says, what I said you do not have. And the Imam alayhi salam, with full gentleness, he smiles and he forgives him. And he says, may Allah forgive you. And the person in return says, and by the way, this statement of this person is something that's oft repeated by a number of people. Those who opposed the Imam, those who hated the Imam, those who oppressed the Imam. But because of this great magnanimity and clemency and the akhlaq of the Imam, they would say, Allah knows best where to place His message. Allah knows best where to place His message. Now let's turn to another virtue. And this is something that's, all of these are relevant to us. And this one, just in particular, given the way that, we have divided ourselves, how we interact as believers. And this is the Imam alayhi salam's attitude towards the believers. He, alayhi salam, said that when the angels hear the believer praying for an absent brother, or praising him, they will say, you are a good brother. God has given you twice as much as you had asked for, and He has praised you just as you had praised your brother. But if they hear him say something bad about the brother, or asking God to harm him, they will say, what a bad brother you are. Stop revealing his sins and praise God who had veiled your shortcomings. And Allah knows all about His servants. So, this is the attitude that He wants to instill in terms of our interaction with one another. Oftentimes, we don't praise our brothers and our fellow sisters enough for the good they do, and we're quick to judge, and we're quick to speak with others in terms of their shortcomings. And here the Imam alayhi salam is, trying to flip that equation. In this regard also, Imam alayhi salam had said, three people would enjoy the shade of Allah's throne on the Day of Judgment. The one who gives people when he asks from them himself, what he asks from them himself. So if you ask for respect, you give people the respect. If you ask people to, to excuse your faults, then you excuse their faults. So that's one. The one who does not make any move before knowing if it pleases Allah or not. That's number two. And three, the one who does not talk about the other's faults until he himself has got rid of them. Don't throw stones when your own house is made of glass. Now, another element that we find socially, and this is something that we definitely ought to learn, is our own tribalism, our own fanaticism, the isms and schisms that we perpetuate, us sort of clinging to our own, and that our own becomes narrower and narrower. It becomes isms, sectarianism, and tribalism, and ultimately, we go from wide lane highway to just the bicycle lane. It's me, my way or the highway. And so, this is a phenomenon that's quite widespread, within our own community, unfortunately, and we have to be very cognizant of that. And so the Imam alayhi salam says in this regard, the kind of fanaticism that is punished is the one that is demonstrated by seeing the evil among your folk better than the good of others. That partisanship, that the evil of your folk is better than the good of others. So we tend to be partisan, and we have to be, we have to become non-partisan in this regard. And he says, it is not fanatical to love your own people. Nevertheless, it is certainly so when you help them in being unjust. So it's natural for us to love our own, but we have to remember this this sense of justice. And here is where Sayyid Muhammad Hussain Fadlallah has a wonderful analysis of this and a wonderful exposition. He says, and I quote, "Thus the Imam tells us that it is your right to love your people, for this is natural. But when it comes to principles, you have to stand by them. You have to be with a righteous human being, whether a relative or a stranger. And you have to be against the evil man, regardless of relative or stranger." This is what the Prophet ﷺ said when he asked about the pre-Islamic proverb. When Rasulullah was asked about the pre-Islamic proverb of supporting your brother, whether he's wronged or he is wronging others. That was the attitude of the Arabs before Islam. And Rasulullah, what did he say to that? Did he say, no, that's wrong? He says, the Prophet said it's true. But supporting him when he is unjust is by preventing him from wronging others. So, that's that's an exposition of that attitude that we have, that that non-partisanship, for us to be principle-centered, for us not to be polarized towards our own group, whatever it may be. It may be ethnic-based, it may be national, it may be political worldview, it may be marja taqlid, it may be the various a tribalism, sexism, ageism, the various isms that we have to be ones who don't consider the evil among our folk better than the good of others. So another virtue of the Imam alayhi salam is his dignity. He was a dignified person, and we find that even let's look at some of the stories that we hear about people who are wrongfully convicted and are imprisoned for decades, and they're released. And where do our minds immediately turn to? What is their compensation? How much are they going to get? They've suffered. How much the Maharar get because of the injustice that was done to him? $10 million, and it's not wrong, for that compensation to occur. But here's the dignity of the Imam. When Yazid was because of the turmoil, and he wanted to kind of absolve himself of it. He wanted to release the Imam a.s. and his family and compensate richly for that. And the Imam said, I want nothing to do with your money. And eventually, Yazid did release them, and he did give the money, but the Imam a.s. distributed it amongst the poor. He would have none of it. None of it. And this was his dignity. Another incident with regards to his dignity, and this is quite profound. It's just how remarkable this great personality was. One of his uncles took his right, and he was in Mecca at that time, the Imam a.s., and at that same time, this is during the ritual pilgrimage, Hajj, and the ruler of that time, after all the turmoils and everything, and after Yazid's death and several others, the ruler of that time was Al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik. So someone had told the Imam, "Oh Imam, why don't you ask for your rights from the ruler?" And what did the Imam a.s. respond? And these words are immortal. He says to that person, "Shall I ask in the house of God Almighty, other than God, the Almighty? Shall I ask in the house of God the Almighty, other than God the Almighty?" And he continues, "Indeed, I refuse to ask the Creator of the world for the world. Then how shall I ask a creature similar to me for the world?" This is his dignity, and his dignity even before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just remarkable. Now let's also turn to his humility. This is another great virtue that he had, and he was, it shows the perfection in terms of his jihad al-akbar within himself. When he would travel, he preferred to travel with people he did not know. Why? Because he wanted to serve them rather than them serving him. So, there's a narrative, a story that occurred where one day he was traveling with a group of people, as he'd like to do, who did not know him. And he was given the task of collecting firewood. And he would go around and collect firewood. Who's this? This is the grandson of the Messenger of God. This is the Imam of the time. He's going about and collecting this sense of mind to say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, and she's, by the way, quoting the verse that Brother Mubarak had opened with, which is, Surah Ali Imran, verse 134. She begins, Al-Kadhimin al-Ghayth, quickly. She got maybe a little bit scared, or I don't know. Which translates to those who respect great wisdom. They've been homeschooled by the Imam. And, they went back to Africa, and they went back to India. And this is how Islam also spread. If you look at the spiritual elements within North Africa and India, the Imam a.s., Imam al-Sajjad, is that source of the spirituality. So now turning back to this maid or this servant, she was pouring water as he was making his ablution, and she grew faint, and the jug of water slipped from her hands and hit the Imam pretty strongly. And then he looked up, and she came to, and then quickly she had drained her anger. And the Imam a.s. says, "I've restrained my anger." And then she continues with the verse. She thought, maybe I can get a little bit more out of this. And she continues with the verse, وَالْعَافِينَ عَنِ النَّاسِ, and those who forgive the people. And the Imam a.s. says, "You are forgiven." And then, again, this is how genius she was. This is a maid. But let's remember, this was the maid who was educated by none other than her master, Imam al-Sajjad. So she ends with the final portion of that verse, وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, and Allah loves those who do good. And the Imam says,